Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to live." My daughter-in-law said it so casually, like she was suggesting I try a new restaurant, not leave the home I had lived in for over 30 years, and for a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Sitting there at the Thanksgiving table with the smell of roasted turkey still warm in the air, the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off the china I had once picked out with my late husband, and I felt every pair of eyes at that table shift, not toward her, but toward me, waiting to see how I would react, waiting to see if I would break. But I didn't. I simply nodded and said, "All right," as if she had asked me to pass the cranberry sauce. And that was the moment everything changed, though none of them realized it yet. And I'm glad you're here to hear what happened next, because nothing about that evening was as simple as it seemed. Not the laughter that followed, not the way my son avoided my eyes, not even the way Ashley reached for Daniel's hand under the table as if she had just accomplished something important, something final. And I remember noticing the smallest details, the way the gravy boat was slightly chipped at the edge, the way the clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, the way my hands remained perfectly still in my lap, even though my heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest, because this wasn't the first time something had fell off. Not really. There had been little things over the past year, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, decisions made without asking me, subtle suggestions that maybe I should simplify my life, that maybe the house was too much for me now. Even though I had managed it just fine since my husband passed 3 years ago, even though every corner of it held a memory I wasn't ready to let go of, and I had ignored those signs, convinced myself that I was overthinking, that Ashley's cool demeanor was just her personality, that Daniel's distance was just work stress. But sitting there at that table, with her words still hanging in the air, I realized something I had been refusing to see. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't emotional. This was planned, carefully and quietly. And the strangest part was not the cruelty of what she said, but the calm that settled over me afterward, like a quiet understanding that whatever game they thought they were playing, they had already underestimated me. Because while they were busy deciding when I should leave, I had already started noticing where everything really stood. And that night, as I excused myself from the table with the same polite smile I had worn for decades, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't the one being pushed out. I was the one about to step back and see the entire board clearly for the first time. I walked upstairs that night more slowly than usual, my hand gliding along the banister polished smooth by decades of use. Each step carrying the weight of something I could not quite name yet, not grief, not anger, but a quiet clarity that settled deep in my chest. And when I reached my bedroom, I did not turn on the light right away. I just stood there in the dim glow coming through the window, looking at the familiar outlines of furniture that had not moved in years, the dresser Daniel had helped his father carry up those stairs when he was just 16, the armchair by the window where I used to sit every Sunday morning with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, and for the first time, I noticed how untouched everything felt, as if the life I thought I was still living had already been quietly packed away without me realizing it. And I sat down on the edge of the bed and folded my hands in my lap, the same way I had at the dinner table, steady, composed, controlled, because that was who I had always been, the one who kept things together, the one who did not make scenes, the one who believed that family meant something solid, something unshakable. But the truth had been shifting for a while. I just had not been ready to see it. And as I sat there, small moments began to line up in my mind like pieces of a puzzle I had been ignoring. The time Ashley insisted on handling the property tax payments to help me out, the way Daniel started asking vague questions about my savings as if he were just making conversation. The afternoon, I found a stack of mail already opened and neatly placed back on the counter with no explanation, and I had brushed each of those things aside at the time, telling myself it was kindness, that they were looking out for me. But now those same memories felt different, sharper, like edges I could finally feel, and I realized something else that made me sit a little straighter. They had not expected me to notice. They had counted on me not noticing, and that realization did not make me panic. It made me calm in a way that surprised even me, because if they believed I was unaware, then I still had something they did not, time, and I reached over to the nightstand and opened the drawer, pulling out the small folder I had kept there since my husband passed, documents I had not looked at in months, not because they were unimportant, but because I trusted that everything was as it should be. And as I flipped through the papers, I noticed a detail that made my fingers pause, something subtle, something most people would have overlooked, but I did not anymore. And I closed the folder gently, placing it back exactly where it had been, because whatever they thought they were doing, whatever plan they had set in motion, it was not finished yet, not for me. And as I lay back against the pillows, staring up at the ceiling that had witnessed so many quiet nights of my life, I felt that same calm settle deeper, steadier, like the beginning of something I had not planned but was fully prepared to follow through. And for the first time since the words were spoken at that table, I allowed myself a small, almost invisible smile, because leaving was never going to be the end of my story. It was only going to be the part where they realized they had made a mistake. The next morning arrived with a quietness that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself was waiting to see what I would do, and I moved through it slowly, not out of hesitation, but with a kind of careful awareness I had not felt in years, noticing the way the early light filtered through the kitchen window, catching the edge of the coffee maker, the same one Daniel had bought me last Christmas, back when gestures still felt genuine, or at least convincing enough that I did not question them. And I poured myself a cup, steady hands, no rush, no sign of the conversation from the night before written anywhere on my face, because that was the first thing I understood clearly now. Whatever was happening, it had been happening quietly, and if I wanted to understand it fully, I would have to be just as quiet, just as patient. And I heard footsteps upstairs, the soft rhythm of Ashley moving through the hallway, followed by the heavier, slower pace of my son. And for a moment, I closed my eyes, remembering a different sound from years ago, when Daniel would run down those same stairs, careless, laughing, calling out to me without a second thought. And when I opened my eyes again, that memory felt like it belonged to someone else's life, not mine. And when they entered the kitchen, Ashley gave me that same polished smile she had perfected over the years, the one that never quite reached her eyes, and she said, "Good morning," as if nothing had changed, as if she had not told me to leave my own home less than 12 hours earlier. And Daniel stood just behind her, avoiding my gaze again, his attention fixed somewhere over my shoulder, and I returned the greeting just as calmly, just as evenly, because reacting now would only give them something they wanted: confirmation, resistance, anything that would make their next move easier. And instead, I watched the way Ashley moved confidently through the kitchen, opening cabinets without asking, the way Daniel followed her lead without question, and I realized something else that settled into place with quiet certainty. This was not a sudden shift in power. This was something that had already been decided long before that dinner, long before that sentence was spoken out loud. And as they sat down with their breakfast, Ashley began talking about schedules, timelines, little practical details that sounded harmless on the surface, but carried something else underneath, something structured, something prepared. And then she mentioned it, almost casually: "We should probably start looking at places for you this week, something smaller, something easier to manage." And I nodded again, the same way I had the night before, not because I agreed, but because I understood the value of letting them believe that I did. And as I took another sip of my coffee, I let my eyes drift briefly to the counter where the mail had been placed, neatly stacked as always. But now I noticed the envelope at the bottom, the one with the familiar logo of the county office, the kind of envelope that usually held official documents, and I did not reach for it. Not yet, because timing mattered more than curiosity now. And instead, I simply sat there, listening, observing, allowing them to continue speaking as if everything was already settled, while inside, piece by piece, the shape of what they had done was becoming clearer, sharper, and far more deliberate than either of them seemed to realize I was capable of understanding. It was not until they left the kitchen that I reached for the envelope, my fingers brushing lightly against the paper as if I were simply straightening the stack, but I knew exactly which one I was taking, the weight of it slightly heavier, the seal unbroken, and I carried it with me to the dining room where the table still held faint traces of the night before: a folded napkin, a wine glass not yet put away, small reminders of how quickly something familiar could turn into something unrecognizable. And I sat down in the same chair I had occupied for years, placing the envelope in front of me and studying it for a moment before opening it carefully along the edge, not rushing, not hesitating, just steady. And as I unfolded the contents, My eyes moved slowly across the lines of printed text, absorbing each word with a calm that would have surprised anyone who knew me. Because what I saw there did not shock me the way it might have a day ago. It confirmed what I had already begun to understand. Changes had been made, official ones, the kind that required signatures, approvals, processes that did not happen overnight. And yet I could not recall a single moment where I had knowingly agreed to any of it, which meant one thing. Those moments had been disguised, buried in routine, slipped into conversations framed as helpful, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the paper rest in my hands as memory began to align with what I was reading. The afternoon Ashley had brought me a set of documents saying it was for insurance updates. The way she had pointed to where I should sign with a gentle insistence that felt polite at the time. The way Daniel had stood nearby, reassuring, distracted, not really looking at what I was signing either. And I had trusted them, not blindly, but with the quiet assumption that family did not require suspicion. And now that assumption felt like something I had outgrown in an instant, and I folded the document neatly, placing it back inside the envelope before setting it down on the table with deliberate care, because reacting to this discovery in any visible way would only close doors I needed open. And instead, I stood up and moved through the house with the same calm rhythm as before, but now every detail carried new meaning. The framed photos in the hallway, the keys placed in the small bowl by the door, the subtle shift in what belonged to me and what they believed was already theirs. And I realized something else that settled firmly into place. They were not just preparing for me to leave. They had already begun acting as if I had. And that gave me an advantage they did not see. Because if they thought the transition was already happening, they would not question the steps I was about to take. And as I paused by the window, looking out at the quiet street that had been my view for decades, I allowed myself a moment of stillness, not to dwell on what was being taken, but to consider what remained within my control. And the answer came to me with a clarity that felt almost inevitable. I did not need to stop them. Not yet. I only needed to let them continue, to give them just enough confidence to believe their plan was working, while I quietly ensured that when the time came, they would be the ones left trying to understand how everything had shifted without them noticing. By the time afternoon settled over the house, everything felt quieter, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because I had stopped expecting it to, and instead, I moved with intention, small, measured actions that would have looked ordinary to anyone else. I washed the dishes left in the sink, dried them carefully, placed each one back where it belonged, as if routine itself could become a shield. And when I finished, I wiped the counter slowly, my eyes drifting again to that neat stack of mail, now missing the one envelope I had already read. And I wondered briefly how long it would take for them to realize I knew, or if they ever would. And that thought did not bring anxiety. It brought clarity, because the less they suspected, the more room I had to act. And I reached for my purse hanging by the door, the same leather bag I had carried for years, its weight familiar against my shoulder as I stepped outside into the cool air, the late November wind brushing lightly against my face, grounding me in a way the house no longer did. And I walked to my car, noticing how the neighborhood looked exactly the same trimmed lawns, the same quiet streets, neighbors going about their day, unaware that something fundamental had shifted in my life overnight. And I drove without rushing, hands steady on the wheel, heading toward a place I had not visited in months, but suddenly felt like the only place that made sense. The office of the attorney who had helped my husband and me years ago, a man who understood not just documents, but the intentions behind them. And when I arrived, I sat in the parking lot for a moment before going in, not to gather courage, but to organize my thoughts, to ensure that every question I asked would lead me closer to the full picture. And inside, the office felt unchanged, the same muted colors, the same quiet professionalism. And when I was greeted and shown in, I did not rush into explanations. I simply placed the envelope on the desk and said, "I need to understand what this means." And as he read through the document, his expression shifted in subtle ways, small tightening around the eyes, a pause that lasted just a second too long. And I recognized that look, not alarm, but concern, the kind that comes from seeing something that should not be there. And when he finally looked up at me, there was a question in his gaze that he had not yet spoken, but I answered it before he could ask. I did not knowingly agree to any of this. And that was the moment The situation became something else entirely, no longer just a feeling, no longer just a suspicion, but something defined, something with edges and implications. And as he began to explain, carefully, precisely, I listened without interrupting, absorbing each detail, each possibility, each option that still remained available to me. And with every word, the shape of what had been done became clearer, but more importantly, so did the ways it could be undone, or at least redirected. And when I left that office, the envelope once again in my possession, I felt something settle into place that had been uncertain before. Not anger, not even resolve, but control, quiet and steady, the kind that does not need to be announced, because it is already in motion. And as I drove back home, I realized that whatever they believed they had secured, whatever outcome they thought was inevitable, was only one version of the story, and I had just been given the ability to write a different ending. When I stepped back into the house, nothing looked different, and yet everything felt rearranged in a way that only I could see, as if the walls themselves had shifted slightly while I was gone. And I set my purse down in its usual place, the envelope still inside, hidden in plain sight among the ordinary things they would never think to question, and I moved through the living room with the same measured pace, taking in the quiet hum of the afternoon, the faint ticking of the clock, the distant sound of a car passing outside, all of it grounding, all of it unchanged. And that was exactly what I needed, because change, I had realized, did not have to be loud to be powerful. It only had to be precise. And I heard the front door open not long after. The familiar sound of keys, the low murmur of voices, Ashley's tone light but controlled, Daniel's quieter, following her rhythm as always, and I remained where I was, not hiding, not confronting, simply present, as if nothing in the world required immediate attention. And when they entered the room, Ashley glanced at me briefly, her eyes scanning for something, perhaps a sign of resistance, a question, anything that might indicate I was no longer aligned with the version of events she had constructed. But she found nothing, only the same calm expression, the same composed posture, and I watched the subtle shift in her shoulders as she relaxed, just slightly, reassured by what she believed was my acceptance. And that was when I understood the true value of silence, not as weakness, but as strategy, because every moment I chose not to react was a moment they revealed more without realizing it. And over the next hour, I listened, the way they discussed timelines more openly now, the way Ashley mentioned calling someone about next steps, the way Daniel nodded along, contributing little but agreeing to everything. And it became clearer with each passing minute that they were moving forward quickly, confident that nothing stood in their way, and I allowed that confidence to grow, because it served me better than suspicion ever could. And later that evening, as I prepared dinner with the same care I always had, measuring ingredients, setting the table, maintaining the rhythm of a life that appeared unchanged, I noticed how easily they slipped into this new version of reality, how naturally Ashley took control of the conversation, how Daniel followed her lead without question, and I wondered, not with bitterness, but with a kind of detached curiosity, when exactly that shift had taken place, when my son had stopped seeing me as someone to protect and started seeing me as someone to manage. And the answer did not matter as much as it once might have, because what mattered now was what I would do with what I knew. And as we sat down to eat, the conversation light, almost pleasant, I found myself observing details I had overlooked before, the way Ashley checked her phone discreetly, the way Daniel avoided certain topics entirely, and I realized they were already living in the outcome they wanted, already adjusting to a future where I was no longer part of the equation, and I let them. I let that version of events settle around us like something permanent, because the more real it felt to them, the more unprepared they would be when it changed. And as the evening came to a close, I cleared the table, rinsed the dishes, and moved through each task with the same quiet precision, knowing that every ordinary moment was giving me exactly what I needed: time, space, and the certainty that when the moment came, I would not need to raise my voice or argue my place. I would simply step forward with everything already in position and let the truth do the rest. The following morning unfolded with the same quiet rhythm, but now every movement I made carried intention, every pause had purpose, and as I stood at the kitchen counter preparing breakfast, I could hear Ashley on the phone in the other room, her voice low but deliberate. speaking in that controlled tone she used when she wanted something to sound official, organized, and I did not need to hear every word to understand the meaning behind it. Words like timeline, transfer, and confirmation drifted just enough into the space for me to recognize the pattern, and I continued spreading butter across my toast with steady hands, as if none of it concerned me, because reacting now would only disrupt what I needed to see more clearly. And when she ended the call and walked in, she offered that same composed smile, asking if I had thought more about next steps, as if my life could be reduced to a checklist she was managing. And I met her gaze calmly, nodding once, saying, "I will start sorting through my things today." And I watched the subtle relief in her expression, the way her shoulders eased, the way she glanced toward Daniel as if silently confirming that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. And that was when I knew they had fully committed to their version of the story, a version where I would quietly step aside without question, without resistance, and I allowed them to believe it, because belief, I had learned, can be more powerful than truth when it goes unchallenged. And as the day moved forward, I began to act in ways that supported their expectations, opening closets, pulling out boxes, placing a few items inside, not enough to disrupt anything, just enough to make the process visible, just enough to reinforce the illusion that I was complying. And I could feel their attention on me throughout the day, not constant, but present, checking, observing, making sure the outcome they wanted was unfolding. And each time our paths crossed, I offered the same calm demeanor, the same quiet acceptance, and with every passing hour, their vigilance softened, their confidence grew, and by late afternoon, Ashley no longer watched as closely, no longer measured every movement I made, and Daniel, who had remained distant at first, began to relax into the routine, speaking a little more freely, as if the tension from the previous night had already been resolved, and I listened, noting the details that slipped through now that they believed there was nothing left to hide. Mentions of appointments, references to documents, timelines that suggested they were closer to their goal than they realized I understood. And I continued my work quietly, placing items into boxes, with care, choosing what to include and what to leave behind, not based on necessity, but on what would serve me best when the time came. And as evening approached, I closed one of the boxes and set it aside, stepping back to look at the room not as a place I was losing, but as a space I was temporarily allowing them to claim. And that shift in perspective settled something inside me, replacing what might have been fear with something far steadier, something far more useful, because I was no longer reacting to what they were doing. I was preparing for what I would do next, and as I turned off the light and left the room, I understood that every step they believed was leading me out was actually guiding me exactly where I needed to be, one move ahead, unseen, and entirely in control. By the third day, the house had begun to change in small but noticeable ways, not in structure, but in atmosphere, as if an invisible line had been drawn that only I could see, and I moved through it carefully, aware that every step I took was now part of something larger than routine. And that morning, I woke earlier than usual, the sky still pale with the first hint of light, and I sat at the edge of my bed for a moment before standing, allowing myself a brief pause to consider the timing of everything that had unfolded, because timing, I had learned, was not just important, it was everything. And as I dressed and made my way downstairs, I could already hear Ashley's voice again, softer this time, more controlled, speaking to someone in a tone that suggested confirmation rather than planning. And when I entered the kitchen, she ended the call quickly, offering a brief smile that felt thinner than before, as if even she sensed that something was nearing completion. And I returned that same calm presence I had maintained all along, preparing coffee, moving with quiet precision. And then Daniel spoke, his voice hesitant, almost uncertain. "We were thinking maybe this weekend would be a good time for you to move." And there it was, the first clear deadline, the moment they had been building toward, spoken out loud as if it were already agreed upon. And I turned slightly, meeting his eyes for just a second before nodding, saying, "That should be fine." And I watched the relief settle over him, the way Ashley's posture straightened as if a final piece had clicked into place, and they began discussing details more openly now, no longer guarded, no longer careful, mentioning appointments, referencing documents, speaking about the house as if it were already theirs in full. And I listened without interruption, absorbing every detail. Because this was the moment I had been waiting for, not the confrontation, not the reveal, but the confirmation that they believed they had already succeeded. And as the day unfolded, I continued my quiet preparations. But now there was a difference, not in what I did, but in why I did it. Every item I packed, every drawer I opened, every decision I made was aligned with a plan they could not see. And in the afternoon, I made one more call, brief, precise, confirming what had already been set in motion. And when I ended it, I felt that same steady calm settle in, deeper than before, because everything was now in place, nothing left uncertain. And as evening approached, I walked through the house one more time, not as someone saying goodbye, but as someone observing the final moments before a shift. And I paused in the doorway of the living room, watching Ashley and Daniel sit together, speaking in low voices, confident, relaxed, unaware that the version of the future they were discussing no longer existed in the way they imagined. And I allowed myself a moment of stillness, not to reflect, but to acknowledge the simplicity of what was about to happen, because there would be no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic reveal, only a quiet correction of everything they believed to be true. And as I turned away and made my way upstairs, I understood with complete certainty that by the time the weekend arrived, they would finally see what I had seen all along. That control had never left my hands. It had only been waiting for the right moment to show itself. Saturday morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of quiet beginning that gives no hint of what is about to unfold. And I woke before the sun had fully risen, not out of habit, but because there was nothing left to prepare. Everything had already been set in motion. And as I dressed and made my way downstairs, the house felt unusually still, as if even it understood that something was about to shift. And I moved through the kitchen with the same calm rhythm I had maintained all week, pouring coffee, setting a cup on the table, my hands steady, my thoughts clear. And when Ashley and Daniel came down shortly after, there was a sense of anticipation in their movements, not spoken, but present. The way Ashley glanced around the room as if taking inventory, the way Daniel avoided looking directly at me, and I greeted them the same way I always had, with quiet politeness, as if this morning were no different from any other. And for a while, we moved through a routine that felt almost rehearsed, small talk, the sound of dishes, the ordinary details of a life they believed was about to change in their favor. And then Ashley spoke, her tone carefully measured. "We can start moving your things today." And I nodded, setting my cup down gently, saying, "There will not be any need for that." And the words hung in the air longer than expected, not because they were loud, but because they did not fit the script they had been following. And I watched the confusion begin to form. Subtle at first, a glance exchanged between them, a pause that stretched just slightly too long, and I reached into my bag, pulling out the envelope I had carried with me all week, placing it on the table with the same care I had used when I first opened it. And I did not rush to explain. I simply slid it toward them, allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace. And as Ashley picked it up, her expression shifted, the confidence that had been so carefully maintained beginning to fracture as she read, her eyes moving quickly, then slower, then stopping altogether. And Daniel leaned closer, trying to understand, his brow tightening as the realization began to take shape. And I remained seated, my posture relaxed, my voice calm when I finally spoke, explaining only what was necessary, that the documents they had relied on were incomplete, that the authority they believed they had secured was not valid in the way they assumed, that certain conditions they had overlooked, had already been activated. And I watched as the certainty they had built over the past days unraveled quietly, not with confrontation, not with raised voices, but with the simple weight of facts they had not anticipated. And Ashley tried to respond, her words measured but strained, reaching for explanations that no longer aligned with what was in front of her. And Daniel remained silent, his gaze shifting between the papers and me, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that could no longer exist at the same time. And I did not press further. I did not need to, because everything that needed to be said was already there, laid out clearly. And after a moment that felt longer than it was, I stood, smoothing my hands lightly against the table, not as a gesture of finality, but as one of completion. And I looked at them both, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a calm understanding that felt far more powerful than either, and I said, I will be leaving, but not in the way you expected, and with that, I turned, walking toward the door with the same steady pace I had carried through every moment of the past week, leaving behind not a home I had lost, but a situation I had already resolved. And as I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, I did not look back, because there was nothing left inside that required my attention, only the quiet certainty that sometimes the strongest response is not to fight for a place, but to redefine it entirely on your own terms.